Hello, and welcome to Then and Now, a conversation with Hosea. My name is Derek Hovind. I am the pastor at Salem Lutheran Church in Orlando, Florida, and for about 26 days or so, I am reading through the whole book of Hosea, looking at some of Hosea in its context, and then let the prophet ask us some questions in our present day. In days 1 through 7, we were able to get through 3 chapters. Today, we're just going to read the first 3 verses of chapter 4. And there is a lot packed into these 3 verses. Hear the word of the Lord, O people of Israel, for the Lord has an indictment against the inhabitants of the land. There is no faithfulness or loyalty, and no knowledge of God in the land. Swearing, lying, and murder, and stealing and adultery break out. Bloodshed follows bloodshed. Therefore the land mourns, and all who live in it languish. Together with the wild animals and the birds of the air, even the fish of the sea are perishing. As was true in chapters 1 and 2 and 3, we begin with some space here of accusation. The words are actually legal in their terminology, right? There's an indictment against the people. But that indictment actually has some important pieces for us to unpack here a little bit. First, there's this sense of an indictment of their relationship with God. So there's no faithfulness or loyalty and no knowledge of God in the land. That knowledge, as we will see later, there's some indictment of the priests and the way that they are teaching the people. So there is certainly a cognitive sense of that knowledge. But the knowledge is also more relational and covenantal. We've heard earlier about this covenant relationship that God has with the people. And so to not really know God is to not know that relationship and that presence. So it is both that mind knowledge and that kind of more heart knowledge that all gets connected in those ways. So that's the end of verse 1, we get this indictment about knowing God and this faithfulness. Then in verse 2, you get swearing, lying, murder, stealing, adultery, violence. All of this is breaking out. If you take the end of verse 1 there in chapter 4 and the beginning or the whole of verse 2, there's actually a great parallel to the 10 Commandments. If you think about the 10 Commandments, right, they start off with 3 commandments that focus on the relationship between God and the people, and then they turn to the rest of the 7 that focus on relationship, like honoring your parents, stealing, murder, false witness, all those things that then deal with the relationship between people and people. So there's the 3 with God and then the 7 with people. And these bits of this indictment in chapter 4 actually mirror that. That first bit, that there's no faithfulness or loyalty and no knowledge of God, mirror kind of that first few of the commandments. And then the turning to this part of swearing, lying, murder, stealing, and adultery very much follow the same prohibitions that are in the second part of the 10 Commandments. So we're only 2 verses into this chapter, and we've already drawn some deep parallels, and because of those parallels, we can read deeply into what it is that Hosea is putting out there as this accusation that the Lord brings. But then there's a really important part in verse 3 that's really easy to miss. Therefore the land mourns, and all who live in it languish, and together with it the wild animals and the birds of the air and even the fish of the sea are perishing. Perhaps we could read this as some sort of metaphor, but what the prophet really seems to be saying is that the bad behavior of the people, their stealing, their violence, their adultery, their lying, their swearing, their unfaithfulness to God, actually has an impact on the world around them. And in verse 3, the first part of it is the land mourns, those who live in it languish. So you've got the physical land as well as the people. And then the wild animals and the air and the sea. This is all about the whole of nature and creation being impacted by the behavior of the people that is moving away from the ways that God would have them act and behave in that covenantal relationship. That's a lot that gets packed into these 3 verses. Brokenness of their relationship with God, brokenness of their relationship with one another, and the deep impacts that has on nature and the world around them. And so as we turn then to what questions the prophet might put before us this day, it's probably lives in that same space of, for the first few chapters, we've been reflecting a little bit on how does our context similar, how do we get away from God, what ways might we be living in those broken relationships. But today then I think the question that we can ask is, how can our unfaithfulness, and we can wrestle with the ways that we define that, be seen in the impacts that we have on the creation around us, in the same ways that the prophet took. How is our unfaithfulness, however we might wrestle with that, impacting the land? How is it impacting people? How is it impacting the air and sea and creatures that are all around us? This certainly is part of our public conversations that we have about climate change and people's role in it. And here the prophet invites us to connect that climate change to our faithfulness and to try to find some good space in there to grow. That is just the beginning of chapter 4 here in day 8. Thanks for being with me. We'll continue tomorrow with chapter 4 and day 9.